planning in your country. So lastly, we're also going to be identifying resources for climate risk planning. Okay, so now that we know what we're going to be talking about today, I think just to refresh our minds on what we talked about on Monday, we're going to do a little bit of a recap. So just a quick review of what long-term strategies are and why they're important and some of their elements. All right. So you saw this slide on Monday. So just as a reminder, we introduced what long-term strategies really are. So these are country strategies or plans that set out a broad vision and a pathway towards sustainable low emission development to 2050. And one thing I want to clarify is that these don't necessarily need to be titled or called long-term strategies or LTS, but these types of elements and objectives can just be incorporated into national level policies or strategies. So these types of strategies or plans are helping countries establish long-term climate and development goals. And also this high-level vision that's being set out in your long-term strategies can help inform your short and midterm actions. So related to that, it can help you be developing alongside of an LTS your national plans, specific sector plans, which we're going to talk about a little bit today and throughout this session, and also subnational activities. So importantly, these also define specific pathways for achieving those goals. So we talk a lot about this high-level vision objectives. These strategies are also essential in delineating how you'll actually achieve those goals. And I think this is really important to remember that these are not totally new. This is just building upon what you guys are already doing in your countries in terms of existing prioritizations and planning systems. Great, okay, so I just want to quickly review the different elements that we discussed. So we talked about these in pretty heavy detail on Monday, so I'll just sort of breeze through some of them right now just to refresh our minds about the different components that can be included in a long-term strategy. So I think first and foremost, one thing we need to remember is that these are not uniform across countries. So long-term strategies will vary depending on the capabilities and resources and priorities within that country. So the level of detail and comprehensiveness will be predicated upon that available capability and resources. So some countries may start with that base version that's just a high-level picture, and then over time, as priorities or resources shift, may start increasing the level of detail and ambitiousness of some of their targets. So just to run through some of these elements again, first and foremost, a long-term vision or goal related to sustainable development. This is really the crux of what a long-term strategy is. It sets out that big picture of what it is that the country wants to do, where they see themselves going, and where they see themselves being in the next 30 years. It also lays out greenhouse gas reduction targets. So these build upon the specific determinations and objectives that you're setting out in your NDCs, but obviously, as we discussed, to a longer time scale to 2050. So these also get into some adaptation and or sector objectives. So these can build upon the adaptation goals you're laying out in perhaps your adaptation communications or your national adaptation plans, or this could take the shape of prioritizing or focusing on a key sector. For example, perhaps you've identified land use or agriculture as a key sector to identify in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So importantly, in that orange hexagon here, climate risk considerations, we're going to talk about this a lot today. This is a key component in long-term strategies and obviously the focus of today's session about how you can integrate these considerations into your planning processes. So in a long-term strategy, this can look like specific callouts or policies pertaining to increasing resilience or plainly just a call to address climate change. Now, obviously, these are all goals and objectives. The bottom two hexagons are particularly important. The implementation pathways or the tools and methods that you use to actually achieve those objectives and targets. And then related to that, once you've been able to actually achieve those objectives and targets, you need a way to actually monitor your progress. So that final gray hexagon at the bottom, monitoring and improvement processes, are the strategies that you use to ensure that you're reaching your objectives and have regular benchmarks. Great. All right, so the other element we discussed on Monday is transparency. So a quick recap here. Briefly and put plainly, transparency is documenting your process. So it's documenting, communicating, and reporting what data you used, how you acquired it, how you used that data, and the methods you used to develop your plan. And by doing all of that, you're making it very clear to both readers and other stakeholders and planners how you did what you did and what the results were, and perhaps hinting at why those were the results you came to. So now that we are refreshed on what long-term strategies are and what transparency is, we're going to dive right into climate risk. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Jen, who's going to go ahead and get us started.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. So I think this is the moment we've been all waiting for, right? The title of this training is Looking at Climate Risk and How Climate Risk Pertains to LTS. I think we've often thought of long-term strategies just as decarbonization goals, but really we have to climate-proof those decarbonization strategies. So to do that, let's first talk about a common definition for climate risk. If you were to Google right now the term climate risk, you would come up with thousands of different hits and probably hundreds of different definitions. So for our sanity here today, we're just going to go with this very simple definition, and we're going to say that climate risk is the potential for loss, damage, or destruction resulting from a climate-related threat. So there's a lot of terminology in here that we are going to continue to unpack. But first, I want to talk about why should we even care about climate risk? Logan, can you pop to the next slide? Thanks. So I don't think that I need to convince anybody in here to care about climate risk. Most people in here are coming from a climate ministry or an environment ministry, and clearly this is part of your job. This is part of what you do. What I have found helpful has always been when I'm engaging with people and talking to people who maybe don't quite understand the concept or maybe don't quite care about it as much as I do, putting numbers to it has always been really helpful. So what can we say about climate risk, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean? You can probably tell me even more about it, but just to put some numbers on it, each year in Latin America and the Caribbean, we see about a hit of 1.6% to GDP because of hurricane damages. That's significant. To me, that is a really great reason that we need to be considering climate risk in the way that we put forth our development planning. In just Argentina and Uruguay, in the year 2017 to 2018, they had $4 billion in crop losses due to drought. So here we're kind of putting it in context of food security as well as economic loss. In the US, where I live, and also where Rob lives, Rob is in California, I'm in Colorado, it's been a very fire-heavy year. So we've had wildfires every week this summer. So obviously we don't have the numbers yet from 2020, but in 2019, we had 1.9 million hectares burned by wildfires in the US. I'm guessing that number is quite possibly going to be even greater by the end of this year. And last, just some more numbers to put on this, flooding. So flooding is a huge climate-related impact from especially hurricanes and tropical storms. So there was over 500 floods occurring in a 10-year period in the LAC region, of which 12 caused more than $1 billion US dollars in damages in that area. So I think these all are good reasons for us to care about climate risk and understand that any development planning, any investments in infrastructure, and any investments in our economies that we're making must consider climate risk going forward. The other thing that I want to point out, again, I think this is something that all of you know and all of you deal with, is that climate threats and stresses can compound non-climate stresses. So this is why it's important for us to consider climate threats and climate risk in the planning in other sectors, right? So what I am showing here is actually a photograph from Pakistan, and this is an informal settlement in Pakistan that has been flooded. And so here we're seeing this interaction between a climate stress flooding and non-climate stresses that are related to poverty and informal settlements exacerbating one another. So just one example of a single sector. Of course, I think we can pull and draw these examples out for almost every sector of our economies. So when we talk about LTS, are we just talking about greenhouse gas mitigation strategies? Hopefully not. We have to consider climate risk as we do that. There are a lot of good reasons to do that. I want to convince you that that's the right way to go as we're thinking about our long-term strategies, is that if we integrate climate risk into long-term strategies, it helps to streamline and identify trade-offs. It helps to ensure that any actions or investments that we make prioritize things that are also vulnerable. It also helps to promote equity. Let's talk a little bit more about each of these on the next slide. So if we want to streamline and identify trade-offs as we're developing our LTS, if we consider risk, we may identify some trade-offs that might not have happened if we were doing, say, a NAP and an NDC separately. So if we keep those as separate processes, it can sometimes be hard to identify an investment that we might make in adaptation that would increase greenhouse gas emissions and vice versa. We also want to ensure that any actions that we're taking as a result of our LTS or any investments that we're making, policies that we're creating, prioritize things that are vulnerable. So if we can identify those vulnerabilities, especially in infrastructure processes and systems, we can help to prioritize those investments that we make. On top of that, and this is something that I've been thinking a lot about in recent times, is how considering risk and climate risk can promote equity. We all know that poorer populations tend to be more vulnerable to climate impacts. And so if we are considering climate risk in our development strategies, this helps to actually promote and enable a much more equitable approach to development. So I just want to show a couple of examples. We talked about Fiji's LTS. This LTS is downloaded and available in your Google Drive if you'd like to dig into it and take a read. But there's a couple places in Fiji's LTS. Fiji is obviously a very highly vulnerable country to many climate-related threats. In Fiji's LTS, they actually draw a link between their NAP and their low emission development strategy. So they say here on the left, the strategies outlined in the NAP are consistent with and complementary to the mitigation actions for the electricity sector in their LEDs. They also talk about why climate vulnerability and risk is important. They say long-term climate vulnerabilities and risks will require regular attention and response measures, particularly as they may undermine mitigation efforts. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, of the trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation and how we can hopefully find win-win solutions as we're thinking about our long-term strategy. Great. And I'm going to pass this off to Rob to start digging in. I think it's going to be really nice to come to kind of a common understanding when we talk about climate risk, not only of how we define it, but the thinking through of threats and vulnerabilities and how that factors into risk.
Great. Thanks, Jen. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run through the couple of standard ways to think through these issues. This is some. Obviously, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. It's just really to center us before we go into the breakouts. So just to split up these terms, and again, it's super helpful to be able to actually think in this way. The first definition at the top there is to think around climate threats and hazards. So these are the actual events themselves. So these are storms, these are extreme rain events, these are heat waves, and so on. Then from there, what those climate threats and hazards do is termed impact. So again, the definition is there. Now, the amount of impact that's caused is also a factor of vulnerability, and that's the sort of underlying pre-existing conditions, if you like, of infrastructure and systems and so on. Next slide, Logan. Thanks. So again, just reinforcing the definition here. A couple of things I wanted to point out to you on the left-hand side is the first bullet there is the difference between acute and chronic threats and hazards. So that's very much like you can think about from a sort of human health perspective, is that acute threats are those that cause immediate injury, almost like a cut, in a sense that they are extreme events. Chronic hazards are those long-term issues like sea level rise, like long-term changes in temperature, and so on. So these threats and hazards, they can be natural, they can be technological, and so on. And again, typically many of them are not within our control. That's particularly the case over the next few decades in the climate impact space, because really what we're going to be dealing with is a build-up from the warming that has already occurred, much of which is actually in the oceans already. And so we're going to be seeing these inevitable consequences of climate impacts till mid-century. And then really, as Jen was saying, the idea of combining the two emissions mitigation pathways together with climate impacts is thinking about how they mesh together from mid-century to end of century, because again, we can actually start to really reduce climate impacts by reducing emissions. So on the left-hand side, some example climate hazards there. You can see that's a combination of the acute and chronic threats or hazards. Next, Logan. So an example that Jen highlighted here, of course, is tropical cyclones. The stats on the left-hand side is from a recent paper that came out last year that summarized the potential changes in tropical cyclones from a 2 degrees C of warming. A couple of things I just wanted to highlight from the stats there on the left-hand side, and this paper is an important update of science that's been really trying to drive down exactly what these key issues are, is that there's both an increase in high intensity categories, but an overall reduction in the frequency. So that's actually a double whammy in that that the folks that are living in your countries that are exposed to cyclones have a reduced history, or reduced sort of being aware of smaller cyclones that occur on a regular basis. And then when a cyclone does happen in the future, it is predicted that they are going to be significantly stronger. So again, that has that issue of reduced public awareness and understanding of the smaller cyclones, plus when they do come, they're even larger. So again, that's a real challenge, moving forward into thinking about how you integrate those two factors into climate impact assessment and adaptation planning. Next, please. All right, so some examples here, and this is a very confronting photograph from the Bahamas of the impact of Dorian that went through last year through an informal settlement. So the impacts here, a couple of examples. Obviously, you can see what the impacts are on settlements. Just to run through what that looks like for power sector and agriculture sector. So in the power sector, damaged poles, transformers, and loss of critical services to hospitals and so on. Example impacts on agriculture, flooded field, flooded crops, damaged irrigation, and then crops leading to food security. I'm going to dig at those a little bit in a minute. Next, Logan. Okay, so just to tease it out a little bit, if we think about the threat on the left-hand side, let's keep using cyclone as an example. So an extreme event occurs. The vulnerability then is here an example vulnerability of a disruption to infrastructure. The impact there you can see on the photo is so-called direct impact. So that's the impact on something. Or it's an impact on operations, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There's an important distinction here between then the so-called secondary impact is the impact of the power going out, and then what that means. So it's important to think about these as sort of primary impacts and then secondary impacts. Now that sort of terminology is actually quite important to think about, because what that means is in terms of the LTS process, is that there might be a primary impact on one sector, like in this case power, and then there might be a secondary impact on other sectors. So for example, the electricity goes out, there will be impact on the agriculture sector because of being able to transport, to be able to raise livestock again if that requires electrical power. Next, Logan. Great. The other thing I wanted to stress to you is that vulnerability is not just the vulnerability to infrastructure, to hard assets. The way that we often describe these is that you'd say the vulnerability to infrastructure, systems and operations, or infrastructure, systems and processes. The reason for doing that again is that it's often a trap just to think about this as impacts on tangible things, when there are all sorts of other implications around worker, for example, worker health and safety, around the financial flows of tax revenues and so on that can come in from infrastructure vulnerability that need to be thought about as an overall, as an overall package and assessed accordingly. Next slide, Logan. All right, so just coming back to some example vulnerabilities here again, picking on the agriculture and energy sector, and you can see them there. These are both climate-related vulnerabilities and underlying, if you like, underlying vulnerabilities from the infrastructure processes themselves, and you can read each one of them. Next slide. Thanks. Back to you, Jen.
Thanks, Rob. We have a couple questions, and this is great. Kelly just asked about exposure, which we are going to talk about exposure when we talk about risk. First, I think let's take a question from Mikhail. So Mikhail's curious about mechanisms used to isolate and identify climate-related weather events from non-climate change-related weather events. I'm not sure if that's something you want to tackle, Rob. Mikhail, hopefully I got that question right. If not, feel free to pop your microphone on.
Got it right. Got it right.
Thanks.
Thanks. Is it Mikhail is your first name, or Andrew?
Yeah, 9 out of 10 people ask that question. Mikhail is the first name. Is the last name.
Thanks, Mikhail. Good to see I'm in that. Good to see I'm in the majority. So look, there's two ways to think about this, and this is actually you've really hit the sort of nail on the head here. The way in which a lot of the climate negotiations were undertaken for many decades was this idea of incremental impact. So and again, the reason there is thinking that climate adaptation finance, if you like, should be allocated only to the difference between normal climate events and those that are fueled by climate. And so, the reason for that was a fear from developing countries that normal overseas development agency financing would be diverted away from poverty alleviation projects, other important development projects. Now that was seen to really be unrealistic in application, because, like you said, how do you tell when we are going through these changes right now of what are the underlying conditions, what is the delta between what was normal and now what is normal because of climate change, the so-called new normal. And there's two ways to think about that. The first way is to really try and unwrap what those differences are. Now, there is an emerging area of science called attribution science, which talks about the likelihood of saying that event was more likely because of climate change. There is, in fact, no way of saying that was climate change, that wasn't climate change. There's this idea of basically sort of like tipping the scales or loading the dice as you throw them. And I typically use that terminology, and in fact, most folks do. They would say, look, sorry, and then the second way of saying it is by understanding that is the case, and using sentences like, or phrases like, we all know the climate is changing. We all know that the cyclone that has just occurred was more likely to occur and was likely to have been more powerful because of the underlying factors of climate change. And so it's this idea of enhancing of enhanced conditions. Now, most of the, in fact, the development community, when you would be applying or for ODA funding through your development partners, you would be able to use that language, and that language is absolutely accepted, which is around saying we in our country recognize the underlying factors are changing and increasing our vulnerability. You know, ... And then in that case, talk about previous hazards, the change of those hazards over time, and then talk about the projections of change, and putting that into a narrative. So again, you don't have to feel that you have to like dive into that. Oh, is it definitely changing or not? You put that into an overall narrative, and that is absolutely the best way to think about it, both for putting in your long-term plans and also for communicating the issue again to your stakeholders. And again, that's understood. In agriculture sector, farmers will be able to tell you about changes, and again, using their language in a way to communicate the issue. Does that help? Okay?
Thank you. That really clarifies it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. I think another thing that popped up, and we're going to go into more depth. So Rob, I'm not sure we need to talk too much about it, but maybe just quickly touch on exposure. If something has to be exposed for the vulnerability to actually have some kind of impact from a threat. But Rob, do you want to just quickly touch on where exposure plays into this? We lost you. You're on mute.
Oh yeah, apologies. Yeah, so exposure is just simply effectively what's in the way of a climate threat. And so, you know, an exposure assessment would be undertaken again using let's use sea level rise as an example. That to think about, well, where are the areas of sea level rise threat, and then what are the assets, operations, and infrastructure and communities within that area. So those are the exposed communities, exposed economic activities. And again, it's useful to start thinking about that using that type of terminology. Jen?
That's great. Thanks, Rob. Yes, something has to be in the way. Has to be in the way of the threat to actually be impacted by it. So, and we'll talk more about that and how that factors into risk a little bit later. I think I'm going to grab one more question before we start thinking through some threats and vulnerabilities ourselves and our groups. There was a question about insurance mechanisms. And Rob, I'm not sure from your experience in UNFCCC negotiations or working in adaptation, what is the economic viability of insurance mechanisms to address climate risks, specifically in Latin America?
Yeah, how long have we got?
You have 2 minutes.
Well, because that's all part of the loss and damage mechanism, which is a whole sort of parallel negotiating process. I think it's fair to say that is a huge issue. That is wrapped up in the whole sort of loss and damage negotiations. This idea of what do you do really beyond the ability to adapt? What does that look like, and how do you describe that? And insurance mechanisms are one of those mechanisms. There are others, but I would encourage the person that asked the question to speak to their focal point in country who works specifically on the loss and damage thread of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and through that they'll be able to understand exactly what what their national position is and what's going on in terms of using insurance mechanisms as an adaptation tool. Jen?
Great. Well, hopefully that 60-second explanation answered your question. So what I'd like to do is, just like we did yesterday, we are going to break into groups, and we're going to do some thinking on threats, vulnerabilities, and risks, specifically in our countries. So I think what we've done is assigned, and I'm not sure, Logan, if it's possible to show it, a group number, a breakout group number. It's going to be a little different than on Monday. And you know what? I'll just drop the link to the spreadsheet in the chat box. So in the sign-in sheet, you're going to have a group number next to you. And that group number, this might be hard to see on Logan's screen, but the group number is then going to link directly to a Google breakout room. So we managed to very successfully do this the other day. I'm hoping we can successfully do this again. If everybody will make sure that your microphone is muted in the main session, but keep the main session open. And if you keep the main session open and the microphone muted, then you can actually pop into your breakout group room. So I've pasted these here in your chat box. Hopefully everybody can see it. So most of the folks from Trinidad and Tobago are going to come hang out with me for a little bit, and that's breakout room 1. Bahamas, you are in breakout room 2 with Rob. I think Rob probably has already headed over there. Breakout room 3 and 4 are with Sam and Logan. And it looks like 3 is Mikhail Donette Venuesa, who we haven't met yet, I don't think. Shian, Didi, Ruth, Kareem, Samantha, Kelly. Group 4, Shomara, Edgar, Beatriz, Lucia, Carla, Javier, Manuela, Jonathan. And if we missed anybody, we can assign you a room. It's a little helpful if you've signed into the sign-in sheet so that we actually know what country you're representing. So what we're going to do is we're going to head in there, and then your facilitator will drop a link to the country folders if you don't already have it. And in those country folders, we're going to find the exercises and presentations that we'll be going through.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Rob. Your group is coming back. Awesome.
Yeah, we had a great discussion.
I'm just waiting for a few more folks to pop back in the room and join us again. What we did do is we did leave a few minutes to hear about what was discussed in everybody's groups. And I am going to be very mean to everybody, and I think I'm going to call on one person from each group, if they don't mind giving us a little tidbit, maybe one really interesting thing that you talked about as you were talking about vulnerabilities, threats, impacts in your country, in your sector, and the status of planning in your sector. So let's see if I can call on my group first. I'm just going to go through alphabetically, and I'm going to ask Mark, would you mind giving us one interesting thing that we talked about or that came up as we were talking through climate vulnerabilities and threats and impacts in Trinidad and Tobago?
Hi, good morning. So one interesting thing that we mentioned in terms of the climate threats and impacts, we talked about droughts affecting Trinidad and Tobago, and specifically one of the impacts was the impact to tourism, where tourism is the hotel and hospitality sector is dependent on the water supply for services such as food and sanitation, and it also affects the biodiversity in Tobago itself, as it is marketed as an ecotourist destination. And droughts itself has far-reaching implications where it affects our potable water sources, at least rationing, especially sanitation in this time of COVID, where sanitation is very important, which has implications to health, agriculture, etc. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. I just popped a question in for folks in the chat box. You know, if you're experiencing climate-related impacts in your tourism sector, can say something in there in the chat box. I'm going to ask Danette to represent her group and tell us something interesting that you talked about as you were talking about threats and impacts and vulnerabilities.
Okay, something interesting that came up. We were, while discussing vulnerabilities, it was discussed that our our geographic location may not necessarily be a vulnerability. However, our size would be considered as a vulnerability, and also our dependence on one main income earner, which is also tourism, as you asked in the chat. Sometimes after a hurricane, our economic sector is very, very adversely affected, especially after, I think, our Hurricane Thomas, and that also affected local residents, which could not traverse from one area to another. So this puts a temporary hold on our economic sector, and this very adverse. Well, this affects us very adversely. So this was something that was discussed.
That's interesting. Good perspective. Thank you. I'm going to try to grab someone from each group. Mr. Hamilton, Charles, will you speak for the Bahamas?
Sure. Yes. So the most interesting thing that I think in terms of threats, exposure, vulnerability, etc., for the Bahamas is our topography. We are among the most vulnerable to countries in the world to climate change and sea level rise, just based on the fact that over 80% of our islands are just barely 1 meter above sea level. And the fact that we are smack dab in the middle of the hurricane belt. So the increasing frequency and intensity of storms is an issue for us. And most certainly, I think that was driven clear by Hurricane Dorian last year. So that's, yeah, we also have an economy that's pretty much dependent on tourism. So climate change, COVID-19, all of that, making a significant impact.
And
over.
Thanks, Charles. And yeah, I mean, COVID is an example of a non-climate related threat. We're not talking much about those, but we can talk about that later. I think one more group, I'm going to grab somebody from Logan's group. Jonathan, can you give us just a quick readout of something interesting that you discussed?
Sure. I had the chance to also listen to another countries and regarding its adaptation problems, such as Mexico. I will refer only to Colombia in this case, which is the country I live in and represent. As I mentioned, the group leader, I work mainly on the mining and energy sector, so the threats were framed only on that, and I identified 3 of them, where is the decrease on rains or hydric outage that we have. So this puts our grid system into stress, because we are mainly hydropower generated country. We have a installed capacity between 70 and 80% on hydropower, so we are highly dependent on that, and that's our vulnerability. Also, the landslides, it's a main risk, because we also have our oil transportation in some areas, or from some oil fields are made through or by trucks, and these landslides represent also a threat on energy security. As far of our vulnerability there, it's regarding deforestation processes that occurs on the surrounding roads that connects these main transportation routes, or maybe it's due the increase on, I don't know, urbanization or conurbanization. That's our vulnerability there. So on the final thing, it's the fires that may endanger our transmission infrastructure that may be due to systems that surround those infrastructure, or by the temperature increase. So that's what I came across.
Thanks. And I think Rob and I can probably both relate to the fire damage to transmission infrastructure. We both live in places where that is actually a frequent occurrence. I'm going to quickly pass this off to Rob. We're going to dig a little bit into risk and how you might prioritize risk now that we've talked about vulnerabilities and impacts from climate-related threats.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Can you go to the next slide, Logan? So it's just important to have a quick introduction to risk, climate risk assessment, climate risk management. It's really combining what we've just described in a slightly different way. It's basically the same concepts that we've already run through in the previous discussion. One of the things I found in working around this issue in my career is that some sectors like risk and risk management, because of the way in which the folks that work in those sectors are trained, the way in which those sectors organize themselves and work through their existing processes, generally using internal risk management systems. And so overlaying climate change on top of their existing systems. Mostly they're engineering-based sectors, so it tends to be sectors around like transport and energy in particular. So again, the idea is that risk management is this combination of the things that we've just described: exposure, threat, and vulnerability. Climate risk, of course, occurs through a combination of these factors, as we've just been discussing. Next, Logan. One of the things I just wanted to touch on is this idea of climate risk screening. And again, this is an idea of thinking about doing a high-level view of a particular sector and using a sort of rapid assessment approach. And this is taken from USAID's guide on doing that. And then from that sort of high-level assessment, then actually diving down into specific risk assessments as required. So you have to read this diagram of starting at the top left in number 1, setting up the scope, and then going down to do the identification of risk, and so on, going up and down through this process. And USAID's got has got some really good guidance on undertaking climate risk screening that are available through the Climate Links website. Next slide, Logan. The way in which climate risk assessment is undertaken is often, or most often, undertaken using a simple matrix, a risk management matrix. This is actually really quite helpful in providing this idea of heat mapping. So again, the idea is that you're combining threats process and vulnerability assessment process and putting those together into thinking around, well, actually, when you combine those two factors, the combination of those is the climate risk. Great, and I see that Jen's just put the chat into the chat window, the link to the climate risk resources. Thanks, Jen. Next slide. Right, and the way, so again, that heat mapping process is often just put together into a simple formula like this, the idea of combining threat and likelihood with vulnerability to then think about impact scores. And again, we're using a power sector example. I do a lot of work these days in the power sector here in California, as Jen was saying, looking at climate risk management. And because the energy utilities that we're working with have well-developed risk management systems themselves, again, using this particular type of terminology is a really easy entry point into thinking about that change, the changes that climate change will bring on top of the systems that they're already using. And then we had a discussion about that earlier in the workshop. Next slide, Logan. So to give you an example, this is one of the projects that Jen has worked on. The idea that what you can do is that you can go through a scoring process. And again, this is a good way to do this in groups, actually, to think through these examples using exposure assessments, vulnerability assessments, and so on, and actually start thinking about, well, actually, what are the different categories of vulnerability? And you can see them on the left-hand side. And then thinking about what the threats are, and then combining those together. And in this case, you can see, again, it's this rapid sort of visual way of thinking about this, that in this case, the key risks are a combination of the infrastructure design and susceptibility linking with the threats of more frequent flooding and increased temperature in this example, with the increased intensity of typhoon winds and so on, and aging infrastructure, the second level of heat. Great, that's just what I wanted to touch on. Back over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Rob. And maybe I can add, you talked about this project. So of course, there's all these examples from the power sector in these presentations. Folks can tell probably who put those in there. One way that we used that really excellent heat map that we were showing is what it helps to do is really prioritize what to look at. We can't address absolutely everything, right? We have limited resources, financial resources, human resources. And so how do we prioritize kind of the highest risk things that we need to address in our development planning? And so doing these heat maps gives us a way to think about priority. And though this is a bit of kind of a high level look, it can maybe say, okay, well, what we need to do is now dig into the real impacts on infrastructure design. Perhaps we need to do more analysis and more research into that. And that might be something we might prioritize looking more deeply into, because we just can't address absolutely every vulnerability. So those that rise to the top, unfortunately, are the ones that we may want to consider more in-depth analysis and look at. So now that we have thoroughly scared everybody talking about climate risk and the impacts of climate risk, I want to talk a little bit about resilience. So really, what is resilience? Again, if you did a Google search for resilience, you would come up with 1,000 different examples, 1,000 different definitions. Here, we're just going to use resilience as the ability of a community, a business, a system, a natural environment to prevent anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions. So here we're talking about things that change over time, as well as withstand, respond to, and recover from a disruption. So we want to build resilient systems, resilient processes, resilient infrastructure, such that they can withstand a shock, and then also anticipate long-term changes that may be happening. And gosh, that really has to do with climate risk, doesn't it? So here, this is the same photo of the informal settlement in Pakistan superimposed next to a resilient city. I want to go here. I actually don't know where it is. That's okay. So if you pop to the next slide, Logan, we're all talking about planning. Most of us here are coming from a planning background. And we talk about planning for resilience. Gosh, this looks really similar to all the other planning processes we probably all already go through. We want to engage stakeholders. We have to gather data. We have to assess threats and vulnerabilities. We just did that. We just did an example of assessing threats and vulnerabilities. And then using that assessment of threats and vulnerabilities, we can prioritize certain actions and develop strategies around that, implement them, and of course, evaluate. But what do I want to say about this process? This process can't be standalone. We can't just plan for resilience. And we actually talked about this in our group in Trinidad and Tobago, is that resilience planning needs to be incorporated into existing planning processes. So you can't have a power sector plan that sits alone and develop a resilience strategy that isn't incorporated into that. So we need to incorporate resilience considerations, climate risk, and other risks into existing planning processes. Obviously, we have to include engagement with a broad set of stakeholders to really be able to understand the full threats and vulnerabilities to the sector. And also, this is something we keep hearing from everybody, we have to revise and update these things periodically. And that's because, these climate threats are changing. And so we have better information, new data. How do we use that to do better planning? So that's why this update, this revisiting, this periodic update of these things needs to occur. So how do we integrate resilience into those existing strategies and plans? Next slide, Logan. So really what we're here to talk about is how do we integrate resilience into our LTS. Our LTS is essentially a document or a strategy that puts out our low emission development plan. So I think we've all seen examples of NDCs or low emission development plans that aren't considering resilience or aren't considering adaptation, and vice versa. We've seen NAPs perhaps that don't also include mitigation or consider the climate GHG or emissions impacts of the actions. So here on this slide, and I just made this last night, I'm showing two axes. Going across the middle, the x-axis is a mitigation axis. So improved mitigation impacts working their way towards the right. Climate resilience on the y-axis, improved climate resilience working its way up. And the quadrant in the upper right-hand corner, the green quadrant, represents actions that are synergetic. So actions that both improve resilience and mitigation outcomes. So examples of that might be something like energy efficient public transportation or renewable energy microgrids for critical services. So hospitals, water treatment and sanitation, instead of using diesel generators. So now we have a synergistic relationship between those two. Actions in the lower right-hand corner, that quadrant, represent things that they improve mitigation, so they're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also reducing resilience, or they're maladaptive. So if you say, okay, we want public transport, it's going to help improve our emissions profile, but we cite that public transport in vulnerable areas, clearly that's reducing resilience. Same thing with hydropower dams. Sometimes developing hydropower dams can be a great way to improve GHG emissions in the energy sector, but sometimes those hydropower dams may impact agricultural production, and that can be maladaptive. Same thing in the upper left-hand corner. Again, we have actions that may improve resilience, but may impact our mitigation goals or essentially increase GHG emissions. So one thing, I work a lot in Asia, Space cooling is going crazy there. It gets really hot. It's getting hotter and hotter as temperatures increase, and air conditioners are being deployed as people continue to increase their income. So space cooling, it's a great way to adapt to those increasing temperatures, but also a great way to increase greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is one way that we can think about how we might crosswalk and prioritize actions in our LTS or in our low emission development strategy to ensure that they also have climate resilient outcomes. Next slide, Logan, thanks. So I want to talk about, of course, with energy being near and dear to my heart, that resilience and mitigation can go hand in hand. I gave a few examples of that, but they really can be win-win. And I want to talk just a little bit about how renewable energy and clean energy in certain situations can be a win-win, both climate change mitigation benefits and resilience benefits. The first thing, distributed resources. So this would be things like microgrids. Distributed renewable generation, when coupled with storage, it can support critical loads in the event of a disaster. And what I'm showing here on the left is actually a photograph of a renewable energy microgrid that's on a hospital, actually a teaching hospital in Japan. I use this example all the time. This teaching hospital maintained power throughout the really large earthquake that we all heard about in Japan for several days while there was no power anywhere else. And they were able to treat patients and maintain full facility operations during that time. And I'm curious if folks have an example of any kind of microgrids for critical facilities in their country, especially in the islands. And if you do, I'd love to see that. Pop that into the chat box. Send me a link. I love using these examples. Diversification of energy resources. We just heard from Colombia, who said a dependence on one power generation resource has actually made them quite vulnerable to climate impacts from drought. So in some cases, renewable energy diversification can provide the diversity to help improve resilience and at the same time, obviously reduce greenhouse gas emissions coming from that sector. Energy efficiency in the same way, it can reduce the need for an increased energy supply and really improve system reliability in the case of extreme events, especially extreme weather events. And so again, a synergistic relationship with improving resilience and improving mitigation outcomes. And I'm sure we could come up with all sorts of examples for other sectors of win-win solutions. And I'm hoping that we're able to do that as we think through our LTS development. And the last little bit of food for thought, and without needing to get into a discussion, but we're welcome to talk about it as we chat more, is the idea of economic recovery and how do we ensure short-term economic recovery is also resilient to long-term climate impacts and climate threats. I've been doing a lot of research into COVID-19 impacts on energy sectors very specifically. What we do know is, COVID has had an impact across the world on economies. And I think we just heard from somebody saying it's really kind of crushed their tourism sector. So almost every country has some kind of economic recovery plan. And often those economic recovery plans include investments in infrastructure, investments in education, a lot of investments and a lot of money looking at short-term recovery and how they can boost the economy as quickly as possible. As we do that, as we put forth these economic recovery plans, questions that we want to ask is, are these investments resilient to climate change? If you're investing in infrastructure, there's a high likelihood that that infrastructure is going to remain for, 50 years, maybe even longer. Here in the United States, I can walk around and I can see, power poles that are 100 years old, truly. And so these investments need to be resilient to some of these long-term changes that we're seeing. And at the same time, are these short-term investments that we're making aligned with our long-term LTS or otherwise low carbon growth goals? How do they impact our mitigation goals when we make these investments in the short term? A power plant that you might build today very likely will still be operating 50, 60 years from now. We have power plants here in the US that are still operating that are about a 55 to 60-year-old vintage. And so those decisions that were made certainly impact that mitigation and adaptation trajectory into the future. So that's just a little bit of food for thought. A few things, and we'll do a little bit of discussion here that I want folks to walk away from today with is, hopefully you all truly believe that if we consider climate risk, it'll help ensure that an LTS is resilient, decreases sector vulnerabilities, and really does achieve long-term goals set forth in that. And that if we tackle climate risk and mitigation together in a synergistic way, we can create win-win outcomes and also ensure that our development plans, are well thought out and those investments are going to be in the right direction. So I want to have an opportunity to have a little bit of discussion. I think we're doing really good on time. I had dropped a few resources into the chat box, especially on the climate risk screening guidance that Rob brought up. But I'd love to open it up to any questions for Rob, for myself, for Sam, or anything that anybody would like to add, maybe based on the past few slides and thoughts about resilience and resilience planning and some of these win-win opportunities. And I apologize, I haven't been monitoring the chat box. So Sam, maybe you've seen a few questions come in that we want to tackle. So I see that in Trinidad and Tobago, you're putting together a health center in a rural area with photovoltaics that will help power the water treatment and the health services. So that's a great example of renewable energy for a critical facility. And that's in a rural area. We can also think about renewable energy for critical facilities, even if they are grid connected, because often, I'm sure this happens frequently, when a storm comes in, the power is knocked out for certain periods of time. And so having an island, what's called an islandable microgrid, can really help boost, the power delivery on those facilities. I think we had a question coming in from Carlos. I have to scroll to see this unless somebody else can.
Yeah, I can
Thanks.
pull that question. I think Rob is going to tackle this, but Carlos was asking how we can combine the top-down and bottom-up approaches for developing a national or basin water sectoral climate risk assessment with different climate scenarios that would provide a resulting sound adaptation or mitigation option for the NDC updating process. Rob, do you want to tackle that? I know you were providing some resources in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Thanks for the question, Carlos. Yeah, I just chatted in a couple of my favorite resources on that topic. There's a really great resource from GIZ that's like 3 or 4 pages long that summarizes the sort of thought process of thinking through which are good things to do at a whole of system or whole of basin level versus what are things to do at a community level, and then actually how to sort of join them together. The other resource too is there's a great set of resources from the National Adaptation Plan Global Support Program, NAP-GSP, which again has got resources specifically for you to help think through that issue. Back to you, Jen.
Great. Carlos, you have to ask the tough questions. Carlos wants to know someone's opinion about large hydropower infrastructure as a mitigation option versus other renewable energy options. I can certainly, oops, sorry, my camera's off. I certainly have a lot to say about that. I don't think I have enough time to say things about that. But of course, what I'm going to say is it depends. It always depends, right? It depends on the type of large hydropower infrastructure, how it's being managed, where it is, other competing water needs in your country. Often, we have to think about that, especially in places with, limited space or, high conflict for that water, high agricultural production needs, for example. So it depends. And it depends on other resources that are available. If we're talking about Colombia, for example, there's a huge amount of solar resource opportunity. I think there's definitely some decent developable wind opportunity there as well. And so that resource availability and that conflict between developing those resources really does need to be looked at. There's certainly aspects of large hydropower that are very beneficial to system management versus some of the challenges associated, which we're not unable to overcome those challenges with the variability of wind and solar. It really depends on what those profiles look like in each country. And so I know that doesn't answer your question at all, Carlos, but it depends, and every system is a snowflake, is what I like to say. They're all very unique, and those are some of the things that we need to think about when we're thinking about power system design, resilience, and mitigation, the intersection of those.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jen. Jen, I was just took a beat to have a look at the battery, the question bank. And there was a great question from Art Fi about insurance mechanisms and climate risk. And Art, I just put a couple of links there into the battery, into the question response, going to the loss and damage mechanism of the UNFCCC and the Fiji Clearinghouse on risk transfer. There's some great documents in there for you to have a look at. And again, I'd encourage you to speak to the loss and damage focal point in your country to dig at that a little bit further.
That's great. I see lots of good discussion in the sidebar. Anybody want to volunteer to offer some of that discussion up in the main chat? Or maybe I can ask this question: is anyone here in their country, does your COVID economic response plan, economic recovery plan in your country include any opportunities for mitigation? Is it saying, oh, we should develop clean energy as an opportunity to recover from this, or perhaps any type of climate-related adaptation investments? I don't think I can say that for our country. So I would be really curious, though, if anybody knows of any kind of small line items or anything that has been put in there in an approach that involves, any climate-related investments.
Hello?
Maybe.
Hello?
Hi.
I can say that this is Dr. Philippe Calais from Ministry of Health, Bahamas. I can say that the government of the Bahamas has established an economic recovery group that has been meeting with the various departments to discuss what the way forward or their recommendations in regards to looking at social development, health, and the economy. So I know we are in the discussion component, and I think I'm grateful for the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection to give health an opportunity to join this workshop, because it kind of opened up our eyes to what we should be looking at in terms of the health sector and its processes and the way it addresses energy and ensuring that it has climate smart health facilities. I would also add that when you look at, one of the PowerPoint items that you'd put up, it noted the vulnerabilities as infrastructure, systems, and processes. And I would encourage a third grouping, which would be human resources and the population, because that's what we found with COVID. If your population is vulnerable or your human resource in regards to your healthcare workers, then that impacts your systems and processes and makes you even more vulnerable. And then in terms of your infrastructure, being able to respond, that's significant as well. So just wanted to make that note.
That's great. I usually lump human resources into processes, but I think you have a really great point that we should pull that out and really emphasize how important that is, and the vulnerability of people, and how that can really affect almost every sector that we're talking about. I think there was an interesting LTS question that came in about designing an LTS that overcomes the change of government administration every 6 years in the case of Mexico, and ensure its implementation throughout time and political shifts. And that is a great question, and I assure you, colleague from Mexico, you are not the only person that probably is dealing with that. I'm sure everybody else can probably say the same. Logan, I think maybe you wanted to address that.
Yeah. So one key element of an LTS is talking about institutional arrangements and making sure that that LTS is translated into other ministries' documents and plans, and making sure that everyone's on board. And then because it's an LTS, you have these. It's translated into a far distant time beyond 6 years, and so by incorporating that long-term strategy into near-term and medium-term planning documents and across all institutions that are going to be implementing it, that does a good job of solidifying that vision and those plans that will be harder to change as administrations change over time. There might be changes that do occur, but having those strong institutional arrangements and relationships will help mitigate those changes. And Rob, if you have other thoughts, feel free to add on.
Look, exactly right, Logan. And I mean, just as a rule, I mean, networks are more resilient to change than simple linear systems. And so, the LTS again provides an opportunity of thinking about how a federal government, in the case of Mexico, works with the provinces and with local governments, and also with industry groups, community advocates, community groups, and so on. And then that system is sort of more robust to individual changes over time that could be at a federal level or at an individual provincial level or so on. That enables that sort of long-term. It's never going to be a straight line, of course. It's the idea really that the idea being is that you build a network that is more resilient to change than you currently have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about the translating down to subnational administrations too. Here in the U.S., the federal government changed course about 4 years ago, but a lot of states have stayed the course and even implemented greater action and ambition. So translating federal policies down to subnational policies is a great way to do that as well.
That's great. Mikhail, of course, you have to ask a challenging question about ocean thermal energy conversion, of which I haven't done a lot of work on OTEC simply because I work mostly in landlocked countries. It's not as much of an option. But what I am going to do is I'm going to find somebody for you to talk to specifically about this technology and those agricultural and fisheries trade-offs that you were asking about. So hopefully by the next session, I will have something for you on that. I see Carlos mentioning that Bolivia did not develop an economic recovery plan so far, but in the short run, an appeal has been made to restore some of the Amazonian forests that were burned in Bolivia and Brazil. And that is one way that people are trying to advocate for including some of those kind of both mitigation and adaptation benefits in an economic recovery plan. I think that's really interesting, a focus on forest restoration as part of a COVID recovery plan as well. Carlos, I can't answer your second question, so we're not going to talk about that. Anyone else? Perhaps, I think we have time for maybe one more comment or question or experience, either on economic recovery or perhaps maybe this is a better thing. Does anybody have an example of kind of a nice win-win adaptation mitigation activity or project or action that is currently happening in your country? Are they that hard to think of? They may be. I loved the example from Trinidad and Tobago on some critical health facilities and putting renewable energy microgrids on those so they can be islanded during periods of power outages. I think that's a great example. And if we don't, I think let's segue into the closing. I want to give folks first a glance at these resources. So the links to these resources are going to be in the PowerPoint everybody has access to, and that PowerPoint is in our shared drive, so you should be able to find that and click through these links. We briefly talked about climate risk assessment and these climate risk assessment tools. What's really great is they're available both in English and Spanish, so please share them with folks far and wide. These tools can be applied to different sectors, infrastructure, health, etc. It's a great way to start integrating, thinking about climate risk in project and activity development. The adaptation gaps reports, NAPS adaptation communications, a lot of those UNFCCC documents and terminology you can find here as well as the registry for adaptation communications. And then one of my favorite resources that walks through looking at risk in power systems. Carlos, it might be something that you're interested in, is the Resilient Energy Platform, resilient-energy.org. You can find a lot of tools of heat mapping, threats and vulnerabilities, and looking at risk specifically, not just to power system assets, but also processes and systems within that sector. Of course, we're happy to, if you have more resources that you want to share, pop them in the chat box, we'll record them and we'll make sure that we share them with everybody. And then I think I just want to give you a sneak peek of next week. We hope that you come back. We hope that you've been enjoying this and learning a lot. So next week, we're going to dive into data-driven decision-making and really talking about data needs and modeling tools, both economy-wide and sector-specific, for starting to do some of the planning and the modeling as you're thinking about LTS and how that LTS might be divided up amongst sectors. We're going to have two really great case studies. We're going to have one that focuses on the agriculture sector and one that focuses on the power sector as two ways to really dive into how to think about climate risk as you're doing scenario planning in each of these places. So please come back next Monday. Same time, same place, same link. I'll be sending out more resources, more information, and I'll also be sending Spanish language translations out from today a little bit later this week as well. And with that, thank you, everybody. Mikhail, I'll follow up with you. And if you have anything else to add, pop it in the chat box. We'll keep the chat box open for a little bit, just until folks make their way out. So I hope everybody has a great rest of the week, and we will see you on Monday.